"May I play for a meal?" she asked. The restaurant fell silent after the first note. She did not knock. She stood outside the glass door of Harlow's restaurant on a cold Tuesday evening, holding a violin case against her chest, and she waited. The case was old. The leather along the edges had worn down to the pale fabric underneath, the way old things wear when they have been carried a long time by someone who had no choice but to carry them. The woman holding it was somewhere in her late 40s. She had dark hair going gray at the temples, and her coat, a long charcoal wool coat, was clean but had seen better years. The elbows were thin. The buttons did not match. But she stood straight, and she did not shuffle, and she did not look at the people passing her on the pavement the way a person looks when they are hoping to be seen. She was waiting for a gap. The door opened and closed, opened and closed. A couple came out laughing, letting the warm air and the smell of garlic bread spill out behind them. A family of 4 pushed in, the father holding the door with one hand and a child's wrist with the other. A group of young men in office shirts came out talking loudly, not noticing her at all. Then there was a pause, a quiet moment between one wave and the next. She stepped forward and caught the door before it closed. Inside, the restaurant was warm and bright, and full of the comfortable noise of a place doing good business. Tables covered in white paper cloths, low lighting that made everyone look a little better than they were, a bar along the left wall where 2 people sat on high stools watching a football match on a screen mounted in the corner. The smell was good, something roasting, something buttery, bread fresh from the oven. The host's stand was just inside the door. A young man stood behind it. He was perhaps 22, with neat hair and a collar that was a size too big for his neck. His name badge said Owen. Owen looked up. He was trained to smile before he said anything, and he did. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" The woman looked at him calmly. Her eyes were dark and steady, the kind of eyes that have spent time looking at difficult things without flinching. She said, "No. I don't have a reservation. I'd like to ask you something if that's all right." Owen's smile held. It was a professional smile, the kind that doesn't change based on what it hears. "Of course." "My name is Miriam," she said. "I play the violin. I was wondering, and I understand completely if the answer is no, I was wondering if I might play one piece here tonight, in exchange for a meal." Owen's smile stayed exactly where it was, but his eyes changed. They became careful. He was not unkind. He was simply young enough that no one had ever asked him this before, and he did not yet know what shape the answer should take. "One piece," she said again. "I won't take long, I won't disturb anyone. If after the first minute you feel it isn't working, I'll stop and leave, and I won't ask for anything." Owen looked at the violin case. He looked at her coat. He looked at her face, which gave him nothing to read except patience. "Can I just let me get my manager?" he said. "Of course," said Miriam. He went. She stood at the host's stand. She did not look around at the dining room. She did not fidget with the case or shift her weight from foot to foot. She stood with her hands resting on the handle of the case, and she waited, the way a person waits when they have learned that waiting is simply part of the work. Owen came back 2 minutes later with a man behind him. The manager was in his mid-40s, heavier, with a short beard and the slightly tired look of someone who had been managing restaurants long enough to have seen most things. His name was Gerald. He had on a dark shirt with the restaurant's small logo on the chest pocket. Gerald looked at her the way managers look at unusual situations. Not unkindly, but carefully, the way you look at something you're trying to place in a category you already know. "Owen tells me you'd like to play," he said. "Yes," said Miriam. "One piece, in exchange for a meal if you feel it's earned. If not, I'll leave." Gerald looked at the case. "What do you play?" "Violin," she said. "Classical?" "Yes." He thought for a moment. The restaurant behind him was loud with conversation, with cutlery, with a birthday song that had just started up at a corner table. He looked at her coat again. He looked at her shoes, which were clean but cracked at the toe. He was, honestly, mostly trying to decide whether this would become a problem, whether she would play badly and the customers would complain, whether she would make a scene if he said no, whether the easiest thing was simply to say yes and manage whatever came from it. "There's a small table near the kitchen," he said. "Not the best seat in the house." "That's fine," she said. "You can play one piece. If it becomes a problem, I'll ask you to stop." "I understand. And we'll see about the meal." "That's all I'm asking," she said. Gerald nodded and told Owen to take her to the table near the kitchen pass. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing before Owen had come to get him, already half thinking about something else. Owen led her through the dining room. The table he brought her to was small and tucked against the wall beside the door to the kitchen. It was the kind of table restaurants keep for single diners, for walk-ins, for situations like this. The tablecloth had been changed, but the chair wobbled slightly when she sat down. She sat down. Owen brought her water without being asked. Then he brought bread. She thanked him both times. She drank the water slowly. She tore a piece of bread and ate it, not quickly, not hungrily in a way that would make anyone look, just steadily, the way someone eats when they are tired, and when they know this might be the only food for a while, and so every bite should be taken with full attention. She did not open the case yet. Around her, the restaurant continued its ordinary evening. A waiter carried a tray of plates past her table without glancing down. Two women at the next table were talking about someone at their office who had done something disappointing. The birthday song at the corner table finished with applause and a child's scream of delight. The football match on the bar screen entered a quieter stretch, and the two men watching it leaned back on their stools. Miriam looked at nothing in particular. She had the expression of a person who is not lost in thought but simply present, sitting inside a moment without needing it to be different from what it was. After she had eaten 2 pieces of bread and finished her water, Owen came back. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at him. There was something in her expression, not quite a smile but the beginning of one, or perhaps the memory of one, and she said, "Yes." She reached down and unlatched the case. The restaurant didn't notice. Not yet. The birthday table was asking the server about dessert. The couple on what looked like a first or second date were both looking at their phones. The businessman in the far corner had his laptop open and a glass of red wine at his elbow. The two women at the next table were still talking about their colleague. The case opened. Inside, the violin lay in its fitted velvet bed, dark wood and clean strings, the bow tucked alongside it. It was not a new instrument. It was not a showpiece. It was a working violin, well-made and well-used and clearly loved, and everything about the way she lifted it out, the angle of her wrist, the automatic, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this 10,000 times, said that this object and this woman had a long history together. She set the violin on her knee and reached for the bow. She rosined it. The small stick of rosin moved along the bow hair in short, practiced strokes. She held the violin under her chin and turned the pegs slightly, checking the tuning with small pulls of the bow against each string, so quiet that only Owen, still standing nearby pretending to straighten napkins on the server station, could hear it. The businessman glanced up. Not because of the sound, the tuning had been too soft for that. Perhaps he had caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He looked at her for a second, looked at the violin and looked back at his screen. Gerald, standing near the bar now and talking to one of his senior servers, glanced in her direction. She was just sitting there, the violin under her chin, the bow resting lightly against the strings. He thought, she will probably be fine. He thought, at worst, we'll ask her to stop after a minute. He turned back to his conversation. Miriam sat still for a moment. Her eyes were open, looking at a point on the opposite wall that had nothing on it, a blank, pale stretch of paint between 2 framed photographs. She breathed in once, slow and full. She placed the bow against the strings, and the first note came out. It was not loud, not at first. It rose into the air of the restaurant the way a single voice rises in a large, empty room, not filling it all at once but reaching, finding the corners, touching the ceiling, coming back changed. Owen stopped pretending to straighten napkins. The two women at the next table paused mid-sentence. The businessman's hand, which had been moving toward his wine glass, stopped. Nobody looked at each other. Nobody said anything. The note was still going, opening up, becoming more of itself with each passing second. And the room, this ordinary, busy, Tuesday evening restaurant with its birthday balloons and its football match and its first dates, went quiet in the way that rooms only go quiet when something real is happening. Gerald at the bar turned around. He did not say anything either. He just watched. The piece she was playing was not a restaurant piece. That was the first thing that Owen understood, standing very still by the server station with a folded napkin in his hand that he had completely forgotten about. He did not know the name of what he was hearing. He did not know the composer or the century or the name of the technique she was using when her bow moved across two strings at once, and both notes came out together like a conversation between two separate voices. He did not know any of that. What he knew, what his body knew before his mind caught up, was that this was not background music. This was something people sat down in chairs and closed their eyes for. The piece was Bach. Specifically, it was the Chaconne from the Partita No. 2 in D minor, a piece that professional musicians refer to as one of the most demanding solo violin works ever written. It runs, when played in full, to nearly 15 minutes. It was composed 300 years ago, and it has never stopped being played, and the reason it has never stopped being played is that it contains something that does not age, a quality of depth that different listeners hear differently, but that all listeners feel, even if they cannot name it. Miriam had played it hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. Her hands knew it the way a person knows a road they have driven in the dark, without thinking, without hesitation, the turns arriving before they were looked for. But knowing a piece is not the same as playing it, and playing it in a restaurant on a Tuesday evening in exchange for a meal was not the same as playing it on a concert stage. She played it better here. That was the strange thing. That was the thing Gerald would not be able to explain later when he told people the story. He had been to concerts. He had a wife who bought tickets every season to the city orchestra, and he went with her and he sat in the plush seats and he listened and he appreciated it. But there was always something between him and the music in those halls, the formality, the distance, the sense that the music was happening over there, and he was sitting over here, and there was a polite arrangement between the two. Here there was no arrangement. Here there was just the sound and the room, and the sound was very close, and the room was very ordinary, and somehow that gap, between the extraordinary thing she was making and the ordinary place she was making it in, closed, fell away. And what was left was just the music, filling the space between one human being and another, the way water fills the spaces between stones. The birthday table in the corner had gone completely quiet. This was remarkable. The birthday table had been the loudest thing in the room for the past 40 minutes, a group of 8 adults and 3 children celebrating a grandmother's 68th birthday, with a foil balloon tied to one of the chairs that kept drifting toward the ceiling vent in the corner. They had ordered 2 bottles of wine and a round of soft drinks, and they had been laughing and interrupting each other, and letting the children run to the bathroom twice. The grandmother, whose name was Pauline, had been sitting at the head of the table with the particular expression of a woman who is deeply happy and trying not to show it too much. When the music started, Pauline was the first one at that table to stop talking. Not because she recognized the piece, though she did. She had played violin for 2 years as a girl before her family could no longer afford the lessons, and she remembered the weight of it under her chin, the way the bow never did exactly what she told it to do. She stopped because the sound reached her before she had time to decide how to receive it. It bypassed the part of the brain that judges things and went straight to somewhere older, and what it found there was not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that included happiness and grief at the same time, the way a particular smell can bring back an entire year of your life in a single second. Pauline put her wine glass down. Her daughter, sitting beside her, noticed and looked at her. Pauline was not crying, but she looked like a person who was standing very close to crying without crossing into it, the way you stand at the edge of a cold lake and feel the temperature of it without going in. "Mum," her daughter said very quietly. Pauline shook her head, not a negative, more like, "Wait, just wait." Across the room, at a table near the window, a couple named Diane and Philip were on their third date, which both of them privately felt was going less well than the first two. Philip had said something in the first 10 minutes that had landed slightly wrong, and neither of them had quite recovered from it, and they had both retreated to their phones in that particular way people do when they are trying to look unbothered. Their food had arrived and they had started eating, and the conversation had become polite and careful, and not very interesting. When the music started, Philip looked up. Diane had already looked up. She was looking toward the small table near the kitchen, and her phone was face down on the table in front of her, and she had stopped eating. Philip put his phone away. He looked at Miriam. He watched her play the movement of the bow, the way her left hand moved up and down the neck of the violin with a speed and precision that seemed impossible from this distance, the way her body moved with the music in a slight, almost imperceptible sway, like a tree in a very gentle wind. He had not thought about music as something that could happen to you without your permission. He had thought of it as a choice. You turned it on, you turned it off, you liked it or you didn't. But this was not giving him a choice. This was simply happening. He looked at Diane. She was still looking at Miriam, and her expression was open in a way it hadn't been all evening, the guardedness gone, and Philip felt something strange and unexpected. He felt glad. Not for himself. Just glad that this moment was happening, and that Diane was in it. "She's incredible," Diane said, very quietly, not looking at him. "Yes," he said. They didn't say anything else for a long time. They ate their food slowly and they listened, and the meal that had been becoming awkward became something else. Not a date exactly, but a shared experience, which is both less and more than a date depending on the kind of people involved. The businessman in the far corner had closed his laptop. His name was Neil. He was 51 years old and he had been eating alone in restaurants several nights a week for the past 4 years, since his wife had left and his children had grown, and his work had expanded to fill every available hour because he had let it. He was not an unhappy man, or at least he told himself he was not, but he lived a life that was very full and somehow also very empty, the way a house can be full of furniture and still feel like no one really lives in it. He had closed the laptop slowly, the way you close something you're not sure you're finished with. He had picked up his wine glass. He was looking at Miriam. The music was doing something to him that he did not have words for and was not going to look for tonight. He was just going to sit with it. He was going to let it be the thing it was, without understanding it, which was not his usual approach to anything. The server who had been taking an order at the table beside Neil stopped writing. She held her pen over her notepad, and she forgot what had been said to her. The customer at the table, a man who had been explaining at some length what he wanted done differently with his side order, also stopped talking. They both stood there for a moment, customer and server, in a kind of mutual forgetfulness. "Sorry," the server said eventually. "What were you saying?" The man shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Whatever you think is fine." Gerald had walked away from the bar and was standing in the middle of the dining room. Not managing, not checking on anything, just standing. He had his arms at his sides and he was watching Miriam, and he was thinking with some surprise that he had made a decision about her the moment he saw her. A decision about what kind of person she was and what this would be, and he had been wrong. Not wrong in a way that embarrassed him, wrong in a way that he felt grateful for. He had thought, a woman who needs a meal. He should have thought, a musician who needs a room. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them was playing out in front of him right now in a way that made his throat feel tight. The music moved. That is the only way to describe what the chaconne does. It moves through different qualities of feeling, the way weather moves through a day. It opened quietly and built slowly, and there were sections that were almost unbearably tense, where the bow pressed harder and the sound became urgent and full of something that felt like argument, like the kind of argument you have with yourself in the middle of the night. Then it would open into something wider, something that breathed, and the room would breathe with it without knowing they were doing it. The child from the birthday table got up. She was 4 years old. Her name was Nell, and she had the particular boldness of 4-year-olds, which is a boldness that comes from not yet knowing that boldness can get you in trouble. She slid off her chair and walked across the restaurant toward Miriam, because she had decided she wanted to see the thing that was making that sound, and wanting to see something was, in her understanding of the world, a completely sufficient reason to go and look at it. Her mother started to rise from her chair to go after her. Pauline put a hand on her daughter's arm. "Let her," she said. Nell walked up to Miriam's table and stood there. She was at eye level with the edge of the table. She looked at the violin, at the bow moving, at Miriam's fingers on the strings. Her mouth was slightly open. She stood perfectly still, which was something 4-year-olds almost never did. Miriam's eyes, which had been closed, opened. She saw the child standing there. She did not stop playing. She did not miss a note. But something in her expression changed, softened, became warmer, and she angled the violin very slightly toward the child, a small adjustment, the kind a musician makes without thinking when they become aware of an audience that is really listening. Nell watched. She watched for a long time, perhaps 2 minutes, which is a very long time to be still when you are 4, and then she reached out and very carefully, very gently, touched the side of the violin case with one finger. Just the case, not the violin itself. As if she understood without being told that some things you look at, and some things you touch, and some things you only come close to. At the bar, the 2 men who had been watching the football match were not watching it anymore. The screen above them continued to show the game, players running, the camera cutting to the crowd, the score sitting unchanged in the corner, but neither of them was looking at it. They were turned on their stools, facing the room, watching Miriam. One of them, a man named Colin who drove delivery trucks for a living and had stopped in for a drink after a long shift, would say afterward that he hadn't cried. And he hadn't. But he had felt something move through him that was big enough that he had needed to brace against it, the way you brace against a gust of wind that comes from nowhere. He didn't know what to call it, he didn't try. The music continued. The kitchen behind the pass had gone quieter too. Not silent, you could still hear the sounds of cooking, the hiss and clatter that never fully stops in a working kitchen, but the voices back there had lowered. The chefs and the prep workers and the dishwasher, who had been listening through the pass, had slowed their movements without deciding to. One of the cooks, a young woman named B who was 20 years old and had been working at Harlow's for 6 months and was saving money to go to college, stood with a pan in her hand and listened. She had grown up in a house without much music. Her parents were practical people who valued practical things. Music had always been something that happened on the radio in the background, incidental, like weather. She had never heard anything like this. She stood with the pan in her hand and she listened, and she felt, with a certainty she could not explain, that she was hearing something important. Not important in the way news is important, but important in the way that a door opening onto a large room is important. Like she had just discovered that the world contained more space, than she had previously been told about. Owen had moved from the server station to the edge of the dining room. He stood against the wall with his arms folded, not because he was skeptical or guarded, but because he needed to hold himself together. He was 22, and he was not yet sure what to do when something affected him in a way he hadn't prepared for. He watched Miriam play. He watched the room around her, and he felt, without quite being able to say why, that he was witnessing something he would think about for the rest of his life. Not a performance. Something closer to a confession. The kind of thing that is private and public at the same time, that everyone sees but that each person receives alone. The music moved through the room. And the room for once let it. 11 minutes. That was how long she played. Not 15, which is the full length of the piece. She stopped at the place where the music lifts, where it shifts from the minor key, which is the color of difficulty, into the major, which is the color of something that has come through difficulty without being destroyed by it. She stopped there and let the last note go, and then she lowered the bow. The room stayed silent. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. Gerald would count those seconds later when he described this night to people, because 4 seconds of silence in a full restaurant is not a natural thing. Restaurants are designed to prevent silence. The music through the speakers, the clatter of cutlery, the movement of staff, the overlap of a dozen conversations, all of it exists partly to ensure that no one is ever left alone with themselves for too long. Silence in a restaurant is awkward. It means something has gone wrong. This silence did not feel like something had gone wrong. It felt like everyone in the room was exhaling at the same time, very slowly, without having agreed to do it. Then Neil, the businessman with the closed laptop and the empty-feeling life, put his hands together. The sound of his clapping was the only sound in the room for the first beat of it, a single person, alone, starting something. And then the birthday table came in, and then Diane and Philip at the window table, and then Colin at the bar, who brought his palms together with the particular force of a man who does not do things by halves, and then the rest of the room, all at once, the applause rising and filling the space that the music had just left behind. The small child, Nell, was still standing beside Miriam's table. When the applause started, she looked around at the room with wide eyes, uncertain for a moment whether this sound was a good sound or a bad one. Then she saw her grandmother Pauline clapping and smiling, and she raised her own small hands and brought them together, though her hands were too small to make much noise, and she looked very pleased about being part of whatever this was. Miriam sat with the violin on her knee and the bow resting across her palm. She was looking at the room, not performing gratitude, not the wide, bright smile of a performer acknowledging an audience, but looking at it the way you look at something unexpected that has moved you, something you did not plan for. She nodded once, an honest nod, not a bow. Owen started moving. He came to her table and crouched down so he was at her eye level, because he did not want to stand over her. That was, he started and then stopped, because there was not a word in his available vocabulary that was large enough. He started again. Can I get you something to eat? Whatever you want. Gerald said. He said it's covered. Miriam looked at him. Thank you, she said. Whatever is hot. He stood up and went to the kitchen. Gerald crossed the room. He moved between tables with the practiced ease of someone who has done it thousands of times, but he was not fully himself right now, and he knew it. He stopped at her table. He was not sure what he was going to say. He had come over because it felt necessary, not because he had a plan. Miriam, he said, just her name. Yes, she said. How long have you been playing? She considered this. Not the way people consider a question they don't know the answer to, but the way people consider a question they know too many answers to. Since I was 6 years old, she said. Gerald nodded. He stood there for another moment. Then he said, I'm sorry for the table we gave you. Miriam glanced at the small table, the wobbling chair, the position beside the kitchen door. "This table is fine," she said. "I've played in worse rooms." The birthday table had been watching Gerald talk to her. Pauline's daughter, her name was Kate, leaned across to her mother and said quietly, "Should we go and say something to her?" Pauline looked at Miriam. She looked at the way Miriam was sitting, composed, unhurried, the violin still resting on her knee, and she thought about what it meant to be sitting at that table, at the end of that question she had asked at the door. She thought about what the music had felt like, and what it meant to make that music, and then wait and see if someone thought it was worth a meal. In a few minutes, Pauline said, "Let her breathe." Neil had reopened his laptop, but he was not working. He sat with the lid open and the screen in front of him, and he stared at it, and after a while he closed it again, fully this time, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He picked up his wine glass. He looked at Miriam from across the room. She was eating now. Owen had brought her a bowl of soup and a plate of bread, and she was eating it steadily, unhurriedly, with full attention, the way she had eaten the bread earlier. Neil watched her eat, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not admiration exactly, though it was partly that. Something more uncomfortable. He felt seen. Not by her, she wasn't looking at him. He felt seen by the fact of her, by what she had done and what it had cost her and what she had asked for. He called Owen over. "The woman's meal," he said, "add it to mine." Owen looked at him. "Gerald already said it's covered." "Then cover it twice," Neil said. "Give the second amount to her in cash for her time." Owen started to say something and stopped. He nodded. "He went to speak to Gerald." Across the room, Philip had put his hand on the table, palm up. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet, tentative, and Diane looked at it for a moment, and then she put her hand in it. They did not say anything. The third date, which had been going poorly, became something else in that moment, not because of anything they had done, but because something in the room had shifted, and they had been in the room when it shifted, and that turns out to matter. The couple at the table behind them, a pair of women in their 60s who had been eating in friendly silence the way old friends eat. One of them turned to the other and said, "We should have come here sooner." The other one laughed, which was not a response to the words so much as to the feeling underneath them, and they reached across the table and clinked their glasses together without saying anything else. Bea, the young cook, came out of the kitchen. She was not supposed to come out during service. The kitchen and the dining room are separated by more than a door. There is an understood line, and kitchen staff stay on their side of it during busy periods. But the rush had slowed, and her section was covered, and she had been listening through the pass for 11 minutes, and she needed to see the woman who had made that sound. She stood in the doorway to the kitchen, and she looked at Miriam, who was sitting 10 feet away eating soup. Miriam looked up and saw her. Bea said, "Sorry, I wanted to see you." Miriam looked at her. The girl was young, with flour still on her forearm, and her expression was so unguarded and so genuine that it was almost startling. "You were in the kitchen," Miriam said. "Yes." "Did you hear it?" "Every note," Bea said. Miriam looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said. Then she went back to her soup. Bea stood there for another second. Then she went back to the kitchen. But she did not feel the same going back as she had coming out. Something had reorganized itself in her, quietly and without drama, the way things sometimes do when you encounter something that is real. The retired music teacher was at a table near the far wall. His name was Edmund. He was 67 years old, and he had spent 38 years teaching music in secondary schools. And after retirement, he still gave lessons 2 afternoons a week from the front room of his house, because he did not know who he would be without it. His wife had died 3 years ago. He came to Harlow's on Tuesday evenings now because they had a good soup, and because it was a way to be around other people without having to talk to them if he didn't want to. He had recognized the piece from the first phrase. He had known from the first 30 seconds that the woman playing it was not ordinary. He had taught hundreds of students. He had attended hundreds of concerts. He could hear the difference between someone who was competent and someone who was serious, and between someone who was serious and someone who had given everything to the music over a long life, and Miriam was the third kind. He had sat very still for 11 minutes with his soup going cold in front of him, and he had listened with the full attention of a man who has spent his life teaching others to hear. And at the end of it, he had felt something settle in him, a kind of recognition that was also a kind of grief, because he was old enough to know what it meant when a musician of that quality was sitting at a table near a kitchen asking for a meal. When the applause ended and the room gradually returned to its ordinary business, Edmund sat for a while longer. He watched Miriam eat. He watched Gerald talk to her. He watched the young cook appear in the kitchen doorway and say something to her. He watched the room reassemble itself around her, louder again now, more confident, people returning to their conversations with the slight brightness of people who have shared something good. He waited until she had finished eating. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to her table. She looked up when he arrived. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "It's not an intrusion," she said. He sat down in the chair opposite only after she nodded at it. He put his hands on the table. He looked at her directly. "Edmund Howell," he said, "I used to teach music." "Miriam," she said, "I used to teach it too." He looked at her steadily. "Where did you study?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Whatever she had said clearly meant something to him. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when a piece of information confirms something they suspected. "And you performed, professionally?" "For many years," she said. "What happened?" It was a direct question, perhaps too direct, but he asked it without cruelty, the way a doctor asks a patient about pain, because not asking helps no one. Miriam looked at her empty soup bowl. "Things happen," she said. "Life gets complicated, health gets complicated, and then one day you realize a long time has passed." Edmund nodded. He understood this. Life gets complicated was the short version of stories that were very long. "Are you still playing?" he asked. "Beyond tonight?" She looked at him. "I play whenever I can find a room." He put his hand in his jacket pocket. He took out a business card. The cards were old. He had them made years ago when he was still teaching full-time, and the school name on them was no longer current, but his phone number had not changed. He placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She did not pick it up right away. "I know some people," he said. "Small venues, community concert series, nothing grand but real." Miriam looked at the card. Then she picked it up and placed it in her coat pocket without reading it, and he understood from this that she was taking it seriously and did not want to perform taking it seriously in front of him. "Thank you," she said. He stood. He straightened his jacket again. He looked at her one more time, at the old coat, the worn case, the steadiness in her face, and he thought about what it meant to carry something of this quality through whatever she had carried it through, and to still be able to sit in a restaurant on a Tuesday evening and ask for a room, and to play the way she had played. "Thank you," he said back, and he meant it for everything, for the music, for the night, for the reminder of what it looked like when someone gave everything they had to the thing they were born to do. He walked back to his table. He paid his bill. He left a large tip for Owen, who had not quite been able to stop smiling since the applause. Outside, the Tuesday evening continued. Cars and people, and the ordinary movement of a city at night. Edmund walked to his car slowly, with his hands in his pockets, and he thought about what he was going to do in the morning. He already knew. He was going to make some phone calls. Edmund made the calls on Wednesday morning. He sat at his kitchen table with his address book open, a physical one, spiral-bound, full of numbers written in different inks from different decades, and he worked through it with the methodical patience of a man who has learned not to rush the things that matter. He called 4 people. He left 2 messages. He reached 2 others directly. The first was a woman named Frances, who ran the community concert series at a small arts center on the east side of the city. Frances had been organizing those concerts for 12 years on a budget that never quite covered what she wanted to do, and she had learned to recognize the specific tone Edmund used when he was serious about something, which was a slightly slower cadence and fewer words than usual. She listened to what he told her. She asked 2 questions. She said she would call him back by the end of the day. She called back in 40 minutes. The second person Edmund reached was a man named Roger who wrote a column about arts and culture for a regional publication. Not a large publication, the kind that circulates through the city and the surrounding towns and has a loyal readership that actually reads it, rather than the kind with a huge reach where most readers scroll past everything. Roger knew Edmund from years back, from a school production that Edmund had organized and Roger had reviewed. Roger listened. Roger asked several more questions than Frances had. Roger said he would think about it. Edmund said, "Think quickly." Roger said, "Why quickly?" Edmund thought about Miriam's coat, about the card in her pocket, about what he had heard in that restaurant and what it told him about the distance between where she was and where she should be. "Because she won't wait," Edmund said. "She's not the kind of person who waits. She'll move on. She'll find another room, another evening. You have to catch people like this when they're in front of you." Roger was quiet for a moment. "Can you get me a contact for her?" Edmund looked at his address book. He did not have Miriam's number. He had given her his card, but she had not given him anything in return. This, he thought, was a problem. He called Harlow's restaurant. Gerald answered. Gerald remembered Edmund. He was the older man who had sat by the far wall and left without speaking to anyone except Miriam, and Gerald had noticed him the way managers notice quiet people who are paying close attention to everything. Gerald did not have Miriam's number either, but he had Owen's number, and Owen had been the last person to speak to her as she was leaving. Edmund called Owen. Owen answered on the second ring, still in bed on his day off, and when Edmund explained who he was and what he was trying to do, Owen sat up. "She gave me a phone number," Owen said. "She said if I ever," she said sometimes, "she offers music for private events. She gave me a card." Edmund took the number down. He called it. It rang 7 times. He was composing a message in his head when she picked up. "Hello." Her voice was the same as it had been in the restaurant level, unhurried, not particularly expecting anything. "Miriam, this is Edmund from last night." A pause. "The retired music teacher," she said. "Yes, I'm sorry to call so soon. I told you I knew some people. I've spoken to some of them this morning." Another pause, longer this time. "That was very fast," she said. "I'm 67, he said. "I don't have time to be slow." She was quiet for a moment. He thought he could hear in the background the sound of a street traffic, a door closing somewhere, the particular ambient hum of outdoor air. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He told her about Frances and the Arts Center, about the concert series, the small stage, the audience that came specifically to hear serious music in a room where they could actually see the performer. He told her it would be modest, no orchestra, no grand venue, but it would be real. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How many people in the room?" "Perhaps 120, maybe a few more if Frances works hard at it." "And the piece?" He paused. "That would be entirely your decision." "I would want to play the full chaconne," she said. "Of course," he said. He had already known she would say this. It was the kind of piece you played when you were saying something, and she had something to say. "When?" she asked. He told her Frances was thinking the following weekend if the room was available, or the one after that if it wasn't. Miriam was quiet again, not the quiet of hesitation, the quiet of someone who is calculating quickly and privately. "All right," she said, "tell her yes." Edmund felt something that he had not felt in a while, something that was not quite excitement, because he was too old for the kind of excitement that shows on the face, but that was closely related to it. A current of energy moving through him, quiet and purposeful. "One more thing," he said. "There's a journalist, Roger. He's interested in writing something. About Tuesday evening, about you." Silence. "I don't know his angle," Edmund said. "I don't know what he'll write, but he's a fair person and he reaches the kind of audience that would come to this concert." "I don't want a piece about poverty," Miriam said. The words were direct and calm. "I don't want a story about a woman who fell on hard times and played for a meal and wasn't that inspiring. I've worked for 30 years. I've played in some of the best rooms in this country. Whatever happened in between, that's mine. It's not a story." Edmund did not rush to fill the silence. He sat with it. Then he said, "I understand, and I'll tell him that. What would you want it to be, if anything?" She thought. "A piece about the music," she said. "About what happened in that room. About what music does when it goes somewhere it isn't expected. That's real. That I don't mind." "I'll tell him," Edmund said. He called Roger back. Roger listened. He said, "She's right. That's actually the better story." Roger had been writing arts journalism for 20 years, and he had learned something that many people in his field had not, which was that the most interesting piece is almost never the one you first think it is. The first version is usually the obvious one, the fall, the struggle, the redemption. It sells, but it reduces people to a shape that they have to live inside forever after, and it says less about the truth of things than it pretends to. The better story was what Edmund had described, a room full of ordinary people going quiet. A sound that bypassed every guard a person carries. What music is actually for, and what happens when it appears without warning in the middle of an ordinary life. Roger called Frances at the Arts Center. Frances had already started making calls of her own. She had reached 3 members of her regular concert audience, the kind of people who showed up to every event and brought friends, and she had described Tuesday evening to them and told them that the musician would be performing the following Saturday, and all 3 of them had said yes before she had finished the sentence. One of them had asked if they could bring people. "Bring everyone you like," Frances said. She posted a simple announcement on the Arts Center's website. No photograph. Just the name, the date, the piece, and a short description. A violinist of extraordinary ability, performing the complete Bach chaconne in D minor. Tickets were a modest price, affordable for most people who wanted to come. Within 2 hours, half the seats were gone. Frances called Edmund to tell him. Edmund called Miriam. She answered on the 3rd ring this time. He told her about the seats. He told her about the ticket sales. She was quiet for a moment and he could not tell what the quiet meant. "Miriam," he said. "I'm here," she said. "Are you all right?" Another pause. When she spoke, her voice had changed in a way that he recognized, the particular shift in a person's voice when they are holding something in order not to let it out in front of someone else. "I haven't performed in 4 years," she said. Edmund had suspected it was something like that. Not quite this long, perhaps, but something like it. "I know," he said, which was not strictly true, but which was the right thing to say. "I practice," she said. "I practice every day. I didn't stop practicing. The other part stopped." "I know," he said again. "What if it's different?" she said. "What if in a proper room with an audience that came on purpose? What if it's different from Tuesday night?" Edmund thought about this honestly. He thought about what he had heard on Tuesday night. He thought about 38 years of teaching people to play music, and the difference between technical ability and the quality that cannot be taught. The quality that comes from having lived something fully, and then found the way to carry it into the sound. "It won't be different," he said. "The room will be different. The audience will be different. The pressure will be different. But what comes out of that violin when you play it, that is not something that changes based on the room. She did not respond immediately. Trust what you heard on Tuesday, he said. You could hear it too, I know you could. Yes, she said very quietly, I could. Roger's piece ran on Thursday, 2 days before the concert. He had gone back to Harlow's and interviewed Gerald and Owen and Colin, the delivery driver who had been watching the football match and had stopped watching it. He had interviewed Pauline, the grandmother at the birthday table, whose daughter Kate had given Roger her name and found her willing to talk. He had spoken to Diane, who had come in on a third date with Philip and had left holding his hand. He had not interviewed Miriam directly. She had agreed to a brief email exchange in which she answered 3 questions. She did not discuss her history in detail. She did not discuss the 4 years. She answered the question about the Bach chaconne with 2 sentences that Roger used exactly as she had written them, because there was nothing to improve. She wrote, "The chaconne is a piece about survival, not triumph survival, which is quieter and harder and more honest." Roger ran the piece on Thursday morning. It was 4 columns, which was long for his publication. His editor looked at it and cut nothing. By Friday afternoon, the concert was sold out. Frances called Edmund. Her voice had the bright, slightly stunned quality of someone who has been in the business long enough to know that sold out is not guaranteed even for well-known performers, and who had just sold out a concert for a musician that most of her audience had not heard of 72 hours ago. "Edmund," she said. "I know," he said. "I have a waiting list." He was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 43 people. Edmund sat down at his kitchen table. He looked at his address book, still open from Wednesday morning. He looked at the window and the ordinary morning outside it. "Open a second night," he said. "Same program, ask her if she's willing." Frances asked. Miriam said yes. On Friday evening, Miriam took the bus across the city to the Arts Center to see the room. Frances met her there and showed her the stage, small, wooden, with good acoustics that the building had been designed around, a low ceiling that caught sound rather than losing it, and seats that curved slightly around the front of the stage, so that no one in the audience was very far from where she would be standing. Miriam walked to the center of the stage. She stood there in her coat with the violin case in her hand, and she looked out at the empty seats. The stage lights were not on, just the ordinary lights of the room, overhead and flat. It was nothing grand. It was 4 walls and a wooden floor and 120 empty chairs. She stood there for a long time. Frances waited at the back of the room without speaking, because she was wise enough to know when a room needed to belong to one person. Miriam put the case down on the stage. She did not open it. She just stood with her hand resting on it, and she looked at the empty seats, and she breathed slowly, and she let the room be what it was. She thought about 6 years old when she had first picked up a violin and felt, with an immediacy and certainty that she had never questioned, that this was the thing, not a thing she would do, the thing she was. Not a choice she would make, but a fact about her, the way the color of her eyes was a fact. She thought about Tuesday evening, the wobbling chair and the kitchen door and the small table, and the first note going out into the air of a busy restaurant, and the silence that came back. She thought about 4 years, and what they had contained, and what she had done with them, and what she had held onto through them. She picked up the case. "The room is good," she said. Frances let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. "Shall I walk you through the backstage?" "Please," said Miriam. They walked through it together. Frances showed her the small dressing room, the entrance to the stage, the sight lines. Miriam asked 2 questions, both practical. She was already somewhere else in her mind, already inside the music, already inhabiting the space the performance would require. Frances could see it in her eyes, the way the present conversation was happening on the surface of a much larger body of thought. At the end of the walk through, at the door of the Arts Center, Frances said, "We're very glad you're here." Miriam looked at her. "So am I," she said, and it was the first time since Tuesday that she had said something like that without the pause in it, without the space between the words where uncertainty lived. She went home on the bus. She sat by the window and watched the city go past, and she thought about the chaconne. She had not played it in 4 years. She had played other things in other rooms for other small purposes, but not the chaconne. It was too large for the spaces she had been inhabiting. It needed more room than she had had. Now she had the room. She went home and she took the violin out of the case. She sat in her chair by the window. She set the violin under her chin. She closed her eyes. And she played. Not the chaconne that was for Saturday. She played something smaller, something quieter, something that belonged to just the room and the evening and her own hands finding their way back into themselves. The sound moved through her apartment. Next door, her neighbor, a young man who worked nights and was sleeping before his shift, did not wake up. But he dreamed something he did not remember in the morning, something with a warmth to it, something that made him feel, when he woke later in the dark and reached for his alarm, that the world was slightly less difficult than he usually believed it to be. Saturday arrived cold and clear. The sky above the city was the pale, washed-out blue of a day that has decided not to pretend to be warmer than it is, and the streets around the Arts Center were busy with the ordinary business of a weekend afternoon. Shoppers, families, a man selling roasted chestnuts from a cart on the corner. The kind of crowd that exists in every direction and pays attention to nothing particular. By 6 in the evening, a different kind of crowd had begun to gather outside the Arts Center. They came in ones and twos and small groups. Some of them knew each other. Many did not. A few of them had been in Harlow's restaurant on Tuesday evening. Colin was there in a pressed shirt with his wife beside him, because he had come home that night and told her she had to hear this woman, and she had looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard that phrase many times and believed it varying amounts. And then she had read Roger's piece on Thursday and bought 2 tickets immediately. Edmund was there, arriving early as he always did, checking the room, watching the staff set out programs. Frances was everywhere at once in the way that small venue organizers are always everywhere at once, checking seats, checking sound, reassuring the front-of-house team, answering questions. Owen was there. He had not bought a ticket easily. Owen had almost not come at all, because he was 22 and he had his own plans for Saturday evening, and he was not the kind of person who normally bought tickets to classical concerts. But he had been thinking about Tuesday since Tuesday, and when his colleague at the restaurant had forwarded him Roger's piece on Thursday morning, he had read the whole thing standing in the kitchen before his shift started. He had read the 2 sentences Miriam had written about the chaconne, about survival being quieter and harder and more honest than triumph, and he had sent Frances an email asking if there were any tickets left. There had been one. He sat in the 3rd row, between an older woman who was already reading the program carefully, and a man who appeared to be in his 30s, and who had come alone, and was looking at the stage with an expression of focused anticipation. Bea, the young cook, was not supposed to be in the audience. She had told herself she couldn't get a ticket and then had not tried hard enough to check, and by Thursday afternoon, when she thought of it properly, the concert was sold out. She had stood in the restaurant kitchen reading Roger's piece on her phone and feeling a particular type of regret that is not quite sadness but is very close to it. The regret of a near miss, of a door that you were standing beside and did not walk through in time. Then on Friday evening her phone had buzzed, a text from an unknown number. It said, "There is a ticket at the door for you. Come if you can." It was signed, Miriam. She had stared at her phone for a very long time. She did not know how Miriam had got her number. She did not know how Miriam knew her name. She thought about it later, and decided that Owen had probably told Gerald, and Gerald had probably said something to Miriam at some point. The chain of small communications that runs invisibly through any place where people pay attention to each other. The how of it mattered less than the fact of it. B was in the audience. Fourth row, left side, the ticket pressed into her hand at the door by a front-of-house volunteer who seemed entirely unsurprised to see her. Pauline was there with Kate and Kate's husband and the birthday table's other adults. Though not the children, it was a Saturday evening, and the children had school on Monday, and this would run past their bedtimes. Pauline had dressed carefully. She was wearing a blue dress she had bought for a wedding 3 years ago and had not had occasion to wear since. She sat in the fourth row, and she looked at the stage, and she held her hands in her lap with a quietness that Kate noticed and did not remark on. Neil arrived late. He came in as the lights were dimming, which is the particular timing of a man who is uncertain whether he should be there at all and has been arguing with himself about it for most of the afternoon. He had read Roger's piece. He had sat with it for a long time. He had thought about the closed laptop and the wine glass and the 4 seconds of silence. He had thought about the life he was living and what the music had made him feel and what he was going to do about any of it. He was not ready to answer that question, but he was here. He found the last seat in the back row and settled into it as the lights went fully down. The room went quiet. A different quiet from Tuesday at the restaurant, not the surprised silence of people who have been overtaken without warning, but the deliberate quiet of people who have come to this room specifically to be still and to listen. The quiet of intention rather than shock. And yet there was something similar in it too, something underneath the intention, an anticipation with an edge to it, the particular quality of a room full of people who have been told that something remarkable is coming, and who are wondering, in the private part of themselves, whether it will be as remarkable as described. The stage was simple. A single wooden chair at the center, a music stand beside it with no music on it, a glass of water on a small table to the right. A pool of warm light from above that fell on the chair and the stand and nothing else. Miriam walked onto the stage. She was wearing black trousers and a dark red jacket that she had borrowed from a woman she knew, not her coat, not the one with the worn elbows. She walked to the center of the stage with the violin and the bow in her right hand, and she stood in the light and she looked at the audience. The audience looked back. She did not sit in the chair. She had decided at some point in the last 2 days that she would play standing up. Standing felt more honest for this piece. The chaconne requires the full body, not just the arms and the hands, but the weight and the balance, and the way a person uses their legs and their back, and the whole of themselves when they are doing something that asks everything. She placed the violin under her chin. She looked out at the room. This is the moment that several people in the audience would later describe as the moment they understood what was about to happen, not the first note, but the second before it. The moment where Miriam stood in the light with the bow resting against the strings and looked at the room with the steady, unhurried calm of someone who has arrived somewhere they were meant to be. Not after a long journey in the triumphant sense. More simply than that. The way you look at a room when you have come home. She drew the bow across the strings. The first note of the Bach chaconne opened into the air of the room. And something happened that is very difficult to describe to anyone who was not there, which is that the 120 people in that room became, for the first time all evening, fully present, not just in the room but inside the moment. The noise that most of us carry with us, the low-level hum of things left undone, things to worry about, things we said and should not have said, things we should have said and didn't, that noise went away. Or rather, it did not go away, but it became inaudible. The music was louder, not in volume, in importance. Owen sat in the third row and felt the back of his neck go warm. Pauline sat in the fourth row and felt the first measures of the piece arrive like something from a very old dream, something she had not thought about for decades, and she let it come. Edmund sat near the back and closed his eyes. Colin's wife took his hand. He had not been expecting this. He looked at her and she was looking at the stage, and her face had the expression he fell in love with 40 years ago, the expression of a person who is completely honest in a moment of beauty, stripped of performance, just receiving. He looked back at the stage. He held her hand. The chaconne is built in sections, and each section has its own emotional geography. There are sections that move like an argument, fast and searching, the bow pressing hard and the phrases building on each other with an urgency that makes it difficult to breathe. There are sections that open out, that become spacious and almost simple, a long singing line that seems to come from somewhere beyond technique, somewhere that technique has allowed you to reach only because you have worked long enough and hard enough and lost enough to earn it. There are sections where 2 or 3 voices speak simultaneously, the violin somehow containing a conversation with itself, asking questions it then answers in a different register. Miriam moved through all of it. She played with her eyes open, looking at the room sometimes and at nothing in particular other times. She swayed slightly, the same small sway as in the restaurant but larger now, more visible, because there was no table hemming her in, and the full movement of the music required the full movement of her body. Her left hand traveled the neck of the violin with a speed that looked, from the 4th row, almost impossible, fingers finding positions that seemed too close together, too precise, too fast for human hands to manage, and yet managing them, producing from the strings exactly what the music required. She did not play it perfectly. This is important to say. There were moments, small ones, the kind that an untrained ear would not catch but that a musician would notice, where the precision slipped fractionally, a phrase that ran a shade quicker than intended, a shift of the left hand that was a half movement slower than ideal. These were not failures. They were the marks of a performance that was being lived rather than executed, and they made the music more real rather than less. Because perfection is a kind of distance, and this was not distant. Bea sat in the 4th row left side with her hands clasped in her lap, and she listened with every part of herself that she had. She did not understand the technique. She did not know the composer or the piece or anything about the tradition it came from. What she knew was what she had known since Tuesday, that this sound was doing something to the air in the room, something to the space between people, something that she did not have words for and was beginning to think she might need new words for, words she was going to have to invent because the existing ones were not quite large enough. At the back of the room, Neil sat very still. He had been arriving at this concert all week without quite knowing it. He had closed his laptop and left it closed. He had taken a different route to work on Thursday, a longer one that went through the park, because he had been reading Roger's piece on his phone on the bus and had gotten off 2 stops early without noticing. He had called his daughter on Friday evening, an unusual call, not because of any particular occasion, just because he wanted to hear her voice and had let himself want it without negotiating with himself about whether it was too much. He did not know what any of this added up to. He sat in the back row of a concert hall on a Saturday night, and he listened to a woman play an instrument that she had played since she was 6 years old, and somewhere in the middle of the piece, in one of the long singing sections where the line stretched out and out like something searching for a shore, he felt something give way inside him. Not break, give way. The way snow gives way in late winter, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the sudden understanding that what felt solid has become something that cannot hold the weight it was holding. He did not cry. He sat very still and he let the thing give way, and he did not try to put it back. The music moved into its final sections. These are the parts of the chaconne that the major key lives in, the parts that Miriam had stopped at on Tuesday evening, the place where the piece opens into something brighter and breathable. She did not stop here tonight. She moved through it and kept going back into the minor key for the last time, into the final pages where everything the piece has said is gathered up and brought home, not resolved, Completed. There is a difference. A resolution answers the question. A completion says that the question has been asked as fully as it can be asked, and that the asking is itself the answer. The last notes came. She held the final chord, the full voice of the piece, all the threads pulled together into one sound, and let it ring until it was gone. Not cut it short. Let it go of its own accord, the way sound goes when a room finally stops holding it. She lowered the bow. She stood. The room held the silence. And then Edmund started clapping from somewhere at the back, and the room came apart in the best way, not the surprised, uncertain applause of a restaurant crowd overtaken mid-meal, but something fuller, more deliberate, the applause of people who had come specifically and had received specifically, and who wanted the performer to know it. People rose to their feet. Not all of them at once. It moved through the room in a wave, row by row, the standing beginning at the front and traveling backward until the whole room was up. Neil was standing. He did not remember deciding to stand. He was simply standing, his hands together, and the room was around him, and the music was still, in some way, in the air. Miriam looked at the audience. She stood in the light and she looked at the 120 people who had come to hear her on a Saturday evening, and she felt something that she had not felt in 4 years, and that she had been trying to convince herself she could do without, and that she understood now she could not do without, which was the feeling of the music completing its journey. Because music does not finish in the instrument. It finishes in the person who receives it. Miriam had been carrying these pieces alone for 4 years, and the music had been complete in a technical sense, but it had not traveled. It had not gone anywhere. It had stayed with her, and music is not made to stay. She nodded to the room. Afterward, in the small room behind the stage where Francis had arranged a table with drinks and a few plates of food, people came to find her. Not a crowd. Francis had been sensible about this, limiting who came back, but a handful. Edmund, Colin and his wife, B. Owen. Owen stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in because he was not sure he belonged in this room. Then Miriam looked up and saw him and said, "Owen, you came," and the uncertainty left him. He said, "I had to." She said, "Yes." He asked her quietly, standing beside the table while other people talked around them, how it felt to play in front of people again after the time away. She thought about this. She looked at the wine glass in her hand, and she thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. "It feels like arriving," she said, "after a very long time of traveling." He nodded. He was 22, and he did not yet know about the long kinds of traveling she was describing, but he understood enough to not say anything more about it. The second concert was the following Saturday. The waiting list, the 43 people who had not gotten tickets the first time, was gone in minutes when the second night opened. More people came for the second night, because word had moved further by then. Roger's piece had been picked up by 2 other publications, and a radio program had mentioned it. Pauline had told everyone she knew. Colin's wife had told everyone she knew. B had told the people she worked with, and several of them had come. The second night was different from the first in the way that second nights are always different. The audience had more expectations, which is both a gift and a pressure. But Miriam played the chaconne again, and it was not the same as the first night, because nothing performed by a human being is ever exactly the same twice, and the differences were the point. The differences were the performance. She played it from wherever she was on that specific Saturday evening, and where she was further along from Tuesday than she had been the week before, and the music knew it. After the second concert, a woman who ran a small chamber music series in another city was waiting outside the stage door. She had driven 4 hours. She had a program from the first concert and a pen, and she asked Miriam if she would consider performing at her series in the spring. Miriam looked at her. "What would you want me to play?" "Whatever you want," the woman said. Miriam took the pen and wrote her number on the program. Frances, who had watched this from 15 feet away, walked back inside and found Edmund standing by the table where the drinks had been. "She's going to be all right," Frances said. Edmund did not look surprised. He looked like someone who already knew and was simply glad to have confirmation of something he had believed since Tuesday. "She was always going to be all right," he said. "She just needed the room." A journalist from a radio program came to Miriam's third concert, which was in a slightly larger venue and which sold out before the program was even printed. He waited until after the performance and then asked her 2 questions, because he had learned from Roger's piece to keep the questions few. The first question was whether she thought about the restaurant on Tuesday nights when she was performing now. "She thought about this," she said. "I think about the soup. It was very good soup." The journalist laughed. He had not expected her to say that. The second question was whether she planned to teach again, now that the performing had returned. Miriam looked at him with the steady, patient expression of a person to whom this question has a very simple answer that she is willing to share. "I never stopped teaching," she said. He waited for her to elaborate. "She didn't." He wrote it up that way, exactly as she had said it, and when the piece ran on the radio program and then was printed afterward in the transcript, those words, "I never stopped teaching," sat at the end of the piece and stayed there, and people read them and heard different things in them depending on what they needed to hear. Some people heard a woman talking about her students. Some people heard a woman talking about herself. Some people heard something larger, something about what it means to carry a serious thing through a difficult time without setting it down, without letting the difficulty become the story, without letting what happened to you overwrite what you are. Owen read the transcript on his lunch break at the restaurant 4 weeks after that Tuesday evening, sitting at the small table near the kitchen door where Miriam had sat. He read it through to the end. He put his phone down. He looked at the table for a moment. He thought about what it would mean to never stop, to keep carrying a thing through whatever came, not because you were certain it would lead somewhere, but because you were the person who carried it and setting it down would make you someone else. He thought about what he carried, what he had not stopped doing even when it seemed small. He picked up his phone, he opened the Notes app, he started writing. He did not know yet what it would become. He just knew that he needed to start. Outside the restaurant, the Tuesday evening continued. Cold and ordinary and full of people moving through it, each of them carrying something, some of them knowing it, some of them not yet. The city went on. And in a practice room across town, Miriam stood at the window with her violin under her chin, and she played.